For more than half a century, Jack Nicholson was one of Hollywood's most fascinating and unpredictable legends. The unforgettable grin, the dark sunglasses, the rebellious charm, he became a symbol of an era when movie stars lived larger than life. But behind the iconic performances and flashing cameras, there was another story whispered quietly through Hollywood for decades. A story about passion, temptation, and relationships that shaped the man behind the legend. Now, at 88, in rare moments of reflection, Jack Nicholson reveals the 6 women he had romantic affairs with, women who changed his life in ways the public never truly understood. Some were passionate, some were complicated, and a few changed everything. Watch until the end, because the 5th woman carried a secret that followed Nicholson for years, and the 6th was perhaps the most mysterious of all, a relationship that quietly gave him a daughter. Number 1. Anjelica Huston. Anjelica Huston first walked into Jack Nicholson's life in the early 1970s, at a time when Hollywood itself seemed to be changing shape. Nicholson was becoming one of the most magnetic actors of his generation, fresh from the success of films like 5 Easy Pieces. Huston, meanwhile, carried the elegance of old Hollywood in her blood. She was the daughter of legendary director John Huston. Their relationship began almost like a scene from a movie, 2 striking personalities meeting at the edge of Hollywood's wildest decade. Nicholson was charismatic, unpredictable, endlessly fascinating. Huston was intelligent, sharp, and quietly powerful. Together, they became one of the most intriguing couples of the era. But their love story was never simple. For nearly 17 years, they drifted in and out of each other's lives. There were glamorous premieres, quiet nights in Nicholson's Mulholland Drive home, and moments of real tenderness. Huston later described those years as passionate, complicated, and often painful. Nicholson's appetite for life, his parties, his freedom, his wandering heart, often clashed with the stability Huston longed for. Still, she stayed. Perhaps because beneath Nicholson's rebellious exterior there was something deeply human. Friends often said that when Nicholson looked at Huston, the bravado faded for a moment. But Hollywood rarely allows love to remain untouched. In 1989, the relationship reached a breaking point when Nicholson began another affair, one that would soon lead to the birth of a child. The news shattered the fragile balance they had tried to maintain for years. And just like that, one of Hollywood's longest and most fascinating romances quietly ended. Huston would later write that loving Nicholson was like living beside a storm. Beautiful, thrilling, but impossible to control. For Nicholson, she was never just another chapter. She was the woman who understood him best, and perhaps the one he could never quite keep. Some loves are simply too complicated to last. Number 2. Rebecca Broussard. Rebecca Broussard entered Jack Nicholson's life in the late 1980s in a way that almost felt accidental. At the time, Broussard was working as a waitress in Los Angeles, quietly navigating a world that was far removed from the powerful circles of Hollywood fame. Nicholson, already a legendary figure thanks to films like The Shining and Batman, was known for living a life that rarely slowed down. Their meeting seemed simple enough, one brief encounter that gradually turned into something far more complicated. What began as a private relationship quickly grew into the kind of story Hollywood could not ignore. Nicholson was still deeply connected to Anjelica Huston at the time, and for years their relationship had existed in a delicate balance. But life rarely follows neat boundaries, especially in a world where fame and temptation often travel together. When Broussard became pregnant in 1989, the quiet affair suddenly became impossible to hide. The news rippled through Hollywood almost overnight. For Huston, it was the moment that finally ended a 17-year chapter. For Nicholson, it marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one that brought both joy and public scrutiny. In 1990, their daughter Lorraine Nicholson was born. 2 years later, their son Ray Nicholson followed. Friends close to Nicholson often noticed something different during those years. The famously restless actor seemed, at least briefly, more grounded, spending time with his young children and stepping into a role few people had ever associated with him: fatherhood. But Nicholson had always been a man who resisted permanence. By the mid-1990s, the relationship between Nicholson and Broussard began to fade. The romance that once shocked Hollywood slowly dissolved, leaving behind something quieter but far more lasting: their children. Years later, Nicholson would rarely speak about that time publicly, but those who knew him understood something simple. Rebecca Broussard was not just another affair. She was the woman who changed the course of his life and closed the door on the longest love he had ever known. Sometimes the choices we make in a moment echo for decades. Number 3. Lara Flynn Boyle. Lara Flynn Boyle entered Jack Nicholson's life at the end of the 1990s, long after Nicholson had already become one of Hollywood's most legendary figures. By then, he had decades of iconic performances behind him. Films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Shining, and As Good as It Gets had secured his place in cinema history. Boyle, on the other hand, represented a different generation of Hollywood. She had risen to fame through the cult television series Twin Peaks, where her mysterious screen presence made her one of the most recognizable actresses of the early 1990s. When the two were first seen together around 1999, the reaction from Hollywood was immediate. The age difference alone, more than 3 decades, sparked endless headlines. Photographers followed them through restaurants in Los Angeles and red carpet events across the city. To the public, the relationship seemed surprising, even improbable. But Nicholson had never cared much about public expectations. Those who saw them together often described a relationship built on humor and spontaneity. Nicholson, famous for his booming laugh and unpredictable charm, appeared relaxed around Boyle. She, in turn, seemed comfortable in the strange orbit of Nicholson's larger-than-life personality. For several years, they remained one of Hollywood's most unusual couples. There were vacations, public appearances, and quiet evenings at Nicholson's longtime Mulholland Drive home, far from the flashing cameras that usually surrounded him. Yet time moves differently in Hollywood. By the early 2000s, the relationship slowly began to fade from public view. The headlines stopped, the photographs became rare. Eventually, the romance ended quietly, without the drama that had surrounded its beginning. But for a brief moment, their story captured something fascinating about Nicholson himself. Even after decades of fame, controversy, and heartbreak, he remained the same man Hollywood had always known: restless, curious, and unwilling to live by anyone else's rules. Some men grow older, but a few never truly change. Number 4. Michelle Phillips. Michelle Phillips first crossed paths with Jack Nicholson during one of the most fascinating eras in Hollywood history, the late 1960s, when music, film, and counterculture were colliding in ways the world had never seen before. Phillips was already famous as a member of the legendary folk rock group the Mamas and the Papas, whose songs had become the soundtrack of an entire generation. Tracks like California Dreamin' seemed to capture the restless spirit of that era. Nicholson, meanwhile, was still climbing toward superstardom, building his reputation in a Hollywood that was slowly shedding its old studio system. Their worlds met in Los Angeles, where musicians, actors, and artists often moved through the same parties, the same houses, the same long, unpredictable nights, and Nicholson was impossible to ignore. Friends from that time often remembered him as magnetic, sharp-witted, fearless, and full of energy that seemed to pull people toward him. Phillips, with her effortless California elegance and independent spirit, fit naturally into that orbit. Their relationship was never the quiet kind. It unfolded in a time when Hollywood itself was experimenting with freedom, rebellion, and new ideas about love. The late-night gatherings in the Hollywood Hills, the music drifting through open windows, the conversations that lasted until sunrise. Those were the moments that defined their connection. But like many romances born in that chaotic era, it was never meant to be permanent. Both Nicholson and Phillips were moving quickly through worlds that rarely slowed down. Careers were rising, opportunities were everywhere, and life itself seemed to be rushing forward at an impossible speed. Eventually, their paths separated as naturally as they had once crossed. Yet their story remains a small but vivid piece of that remarkable decade, a time when Hollywood felt less like an industry and more like a cultural revolution. And Nicholson stood right at its center. Some relationships are remembered not for how long they lasted, but for the era they represent. Number 5. Susan Anspach. Susan Anspach entered Jack Nicholson's world during the early 1970s, a time when Hollywood itself seemed to be reinventing its identity. Nicholson had just begun transforming from a promising actor into a symbol of the rebellious new Hollywood era, especially after his unforgettable performance in 5 Easy Pieces. Anspach was part of that same creative movement. She wasn't a traditional Hollywood starlet. Instead, she carried a natural authenticity that made her performances feel deeply human. Audiences first noticed her emotional intensity in films like 5 Easy Pieces, and later, Play It Again, Sam, where her presence brought a quiet strength to the screen. It was during this period of artistic exploration that Nicholson and Anspach grew close. Hollywood in the early 1970s was a place where actors often formed deep connections through their work. Long days on set, late-night conversations about art and life, and the unpredictable energy of a changing film industry created relationships that blurred the line between professional and personal. For Nicholson and Anspach, that closeness eventually became romantic, but their story carried a complication that would follow Nicholson for years. In 1970, Anspach gave birth to a son, Caleb James Goddard. For a long time, there were whispers throughout Hollywood that Nicholson might be the father. The subject remained delicate and largely unspoken in public interviews. Eventually, Nicholson acknowledged the child as his own, quietly accepting a responsibility that many in Hollywood had long suspected. Yet despite this connection, their relationship itself did not continue. Number 6. Winnie Hallman. Winnie Hallman entered Jack Nicholson's life during the mid-1980s, a time when Nicholson was already firmly established as one of Hollywood's most powerful and recognizable actors. By then, films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Shining had turned him into a cinematic icon, admired not only for his talent, but also for the mysterious personal life that seemed to follow him everywhere. Hallman was a Danish model, whose elegance and quiet confidence stood out in the glamorous circles Nicholson often moved through. Unlike many Hollywood romances that began in front of cameras or on film sets, their connection reportedly began in a far more private setting, away from the intense spotlight that usually surrounded Nicholson. Those who knew Nicholson often described him as someone who was drawn to strong personalities, women who carried their own identity and independence. Hallman fit that description perfectly. She was poised, thoughtful, and comfortable outside the chaotic rhythm of Hollywood fame. Their relationship remained mostly out of public view, but it would eventually become one of the most important chapters in Nicholson's personal life. In 1981, Hallman gave birth to a daughter, Honey Hallman. While Nicholson initially kept a respectful distance from the public conversation surrounding the child, he later acknowledged Honey as his daughter. The revelation added another layer to Nicholson's already complicated reputation as both a Hollywood legend and a man whose private life often unfolded far from the public eye. For Nicholson, the situation reflected something deeper about the life he had built. Fame had opened doors to extraordinary experiences, but it had also created a life where relationships sometimes moved faster than anyone expected. The romance between Nicholson and Hallman eventually faded, as many of his relationships did. Yet their story remained significant, not because of headlines or scandal, but because of the life that came from it. Sometimes the quietest relationships leave the most permanent mark on a man's life. For decades, Jack Nicholson lived a life that felt larger than Hollywood itself. The fame, the unforgettable performances, the iconic smile behind those dark sunglasses. All of it helped build a legend that audiences still admire today. Yet behind the awards and unforgettable films were real relationships, real emotions, and moments that shaped the man the world came to know. Some of these romances were brief. Others left deeper marks that time never quite erased. Because, in the end, even legends are defined not only by the roles they play, but by the people who pass through their lives. If you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden sides of Hollywood's greatest legends, be sure to subscribe to Legendary Archives for more timeless stories.